Laurie Marhoefer is a historian of the queer and transgender past. His work has been influential in public conversations about queer and trans people living in Germany under the Weimar Republic and the Nazi state. In 2024, he helped to co-write historians' amicus brief for the pivotal U.S. Supreme Court case, the U.S. versus Germany. He also wrote a biography of the Asian Canadian gay activist and Vancouver resident, Li Shui Tong, who was the romantic partner of Magnus Hirschfeld. Marhoefer is a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, my alma mater, where he lives with his child and his dog. And he's currently writing Trans Berlin, which is due out with Tiny Reparations, which is a part of Penguin Random House. It's due out in 2027. So the title of the talk is Trans Berlin, Making the Modern Transgender World in Jazz Age Germany. So please join me in welcoming Laurie Marhoefer.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you so much, Hill, for getting the grant for this. It's an incredible project. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks to the archive and the Canada chair for hosting this. So this, now it's been a little while and a whole host of horrible things have happened since Gaston wrote this. But this was what, like, in March. And I thought it's something that like Amy has written about, and I'm excited to read that piece. But this pattern where trans stuff, people assume that it's new, and here you have like somebody who's very much trans and allied with the struggle, like referring to the newness of these rights and legal procedures. And Amy, like, I think likens this to the goldfish phenomenon, which is a really great way to think about it. So my point in this talk is not just that like the things that Gaston is thinking about are much older than Gaston knows, but that there's a very old relationship between transness and liberal democracy that's similar to what we're seeing today, and yet goes back much further than we remember, many of us. And I'm going to start with the story of a woman who has come to be very dear to my heart and is somebody who I did not know about until recently, but her story has been in the library upstairs since before I was born, in a book that was published and widely read. But I only recently met her, and she's an incredible person. So let me start with just telling you about her life. When Johanna was about 5 years old in 1867, her father and mother died of tuberculosis. This was in the foothills of the Alps in the southwestern Austro-Hungarian Empire, today part of Austria. Johanna and her two siblings were sent to live among a large extended Catholic family, scattered among the mountain villages. A rather severe aunt and uncle came to collect little Johanna. This aunt and uncle were pious, something to which Johanna was not accustomed, and in their house they forbade her to dress as a girl. This was a shock to her. From as early as she could remember, Johanna had worn dresses. At first, that was completely normal. In the 1860s, toddlers wore dresses regardless of their sex. But though everyone seemed to think Johanna was a boy, and she had a boy's name, her parents had let her stay in dresses long after her younger brother was wearing pants, because Johanna was so opposed to it. Now, however, her aunt and uncle decreed that she must dress as a boy. They made one exception, Shrove Tuesday, the day before the beginning of Lent, which for hundreds of years had been a carnival day, a day of masquerade, of the turning upside down of the regular order of things. Johanna looked forward to that one day with great excitement, a day on which she could be a girl for an entire day, in petticoats and a white apron. Though there was ever a shadow on her happiness, because not only on that one day, but on all of the days of the calendar, she wanted to be a girl. The following day, the gray first day of Lent, she must once again pull on her hated boy's costume. If she complained, they beat her and teased her. Soon the devout aunt and uncle grew weary and brought Johanna to an orphanage. It was a Catholic orphanage, in Bregenz, Austria, which was then a city of about 7,000 people, the region's largest city. The orphanage was run by an order of nuns, the Sisters of Mercy. Alone there and forced to dress as a boy, missing her parents and siblings, Johanna was dispirited and afraid. The children wore plain uniforms and were required to carry out chores. The nuns' aspiration was to raise them to be useful workers, servants of Christ. They rose with the nuns at 5 a.m., the older children helping the younger ones to wash and dress. Then breakfast, work, morning mass, back to work until lunch. After they washed the lunch dishes, they were allowed to go out into the garden, where they could play so long as they did not grow too boisterous. Then it was back to work. In the late afternoon, they had instruction from the nuns. Then they returned to work. I put all this in because I have a 9-year-old who doesn't do the chores, partially. After dinner, there might be a recreation hour where a nun would read aloud to them. Bed was 8 o'clock. They were to obey the nuns without a hint of defiance, and some nuns were cruel and beat the orphans. It was an austere life, but the nuns taught her to read and to write. And after a time, one of the sisters took a shine to little Johanna. It was the Reverend Mother, Joachima. Johanna was an agreeable, sweet child, such an intelligent child, Reverend Mother Joachima noticed. The rule of the order, the rule governing the Sisters of Mercy, forbade a nun from leaving the cloister alone. She must go with another sister, or if none was available, with one of the girls. The sisters had, in fact, begun to take in the orphans for this purpose. Instead of taking one of the other orphans, however, Mother Joachima began to take little Johanna around with her on her visits to local pastors or to other convents in the area. The Reverend Mother became like a second mother, hugging her close and allowing her little privileges. Yet, as Johanna grew older, she came to see that the Reverend Mother's hope for her future was not what she herself wanted. The Reverend Mother dreamed of the best possible life for her beloved charge, to become a priest. She said, "Your parents will be released from the fires of purgatory as soon as you say your first Mass." But Johanna was not sure she believed in purgatory. Besides, she had realized that once she was a grown-up and she earned her own living, she could live as a woman. She made it her solemn pledge to do this. When Johanna turned 14, the time grew near where she would be sent to the bishop's school to train as a priest. She feared that her dream of getting away, of living as a woman, would never come true. That year, the Sisters of Mercy sent her off to work on a farm for a season. Until child labor was banned in 1885, the nuns had a policy of hiring the orphans out to work, to instill in them the love of work, which was godly, with any wages coming back to the order. Johanna became a farm boy in the foothills of the mountains for a rich landowner who owned many alpine huts and meadows where he kept cows. There were other children working on the farm, and one of them was a girl about Johanna's age. Johanna noticed that this girl happened to resemble her somewhat. One night, while everyone else was asleep, Johanna snuck out of her bed. She went to the place where the other girl kept her things and quietly took out a suit of the girl's clothing and the girl's Heimatschein, her residency certificate, which was a very, interestingly, like a very early form of government identification, like an internal passport within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Johanna silently folded the Heimatschein away. Then she crept out into the night, carrying the clothing and her own meager possessions. She crossed a meadow in the moonlight. She found a place well away from the huts, and she made a little fire. She took off her boy's clothing and put on the dress, and she threw the boy's clothing into the fire. The flames rendered the hated costume into nothing but smoke and ashes. In the fire's light, an enormous sense of relief came over Johanna. When the fire died, she kicked out the ashes, steadied herself, and set off towards the road, making her way west to Switzerland, where no one would know her, where no one would ever again, she hoped, force her to be a boy. She walked all night. "I will leave everything to do with a boy in Austria," she told herself. Today, some people think of transgender people as having begun to exist in the 20th century or even very recently. But the historical record shows that stories like Johanna's are part of the human condition, evident in many different times and places, well into the deep past. Johanna was following in a long line of people who had, like her, had a powerful feeling that they had been misassigned to the wrong sex, and rather than living their entire lives with that unsettling feeling, decided to do something about it. She had taken an unusual step, but not an unprecedented one. For many people, the way to do this was what Johanna came up with: change in an instant, then go far away where no one knows you and keep the secret for life. These people did not leave traces on purpose, and we don't have all that many records. Yet we do have quite a few records. A lot of them exist because the person who transitioned sadly ran into some insurmountable challenge. People found out. Eleanor Reichener, for example, was hauled into a London court in 1395 for selling sex and dressing as a woman. In Poland in 1561, a former monk was determined by officials in Krakow to in fact be a woman and ordered to live as one. In 1777, a court convicted a trans man for wearing men's clothing and marrying 3 women and sentenced him to the pillory, where the crowd pelted him with objects, blinding him. Johanna was following a very old path, one that the people who had gone before her had sometimes paid with their lives to walk upon. In Switzerland, Johanna quickly found work as a housemaid and nanny. She found it was hard being a 14-year-old girl alone in the world. What was not hard, however, was convincing the world that she was indeed a girl. Right away, everyone assumed that she was. To her advantage, ironically, was how strict gender was in her day and age. Practically everything was coded by gender, from jobs to grooming to ways of carrying oneself, to where one could or could not walk in the city alone, to who one spoke with and how one spoke with them. The foremost sign of gender was clothing, and dress for men and women was extremely distinctive, so much so that you could tell a person's gender from a long way off without seeing their face. When Johanna put on her dress, people did not look further than that. Indeed, in Switzerland and in the years that followed, the trouble that Johanna had was not exactly what I assumed it would be when I first learned her story. Most people never guessed that she was a transgender woman. Most of the time, she moved through the world without drawing anyone's notice. The trouble was that she was a woman in the second half of the 19th century. She was subjected to the coercion and violence that all women were. On top of that, Johanna had the added complication of the police. There were laws against cross-dressing, which was what the police would have said she was doing if they ever found her, which they never did. Yet the threat of police power gave power to unscrupulous people. When Johanna was 16 and a half, a man sexually assaulted her. Johanna fought him off, but in the struggle, he realized that she was different. He called her a quote-unquote hermaphrodite and told people about her, and she had to leave Switzerland, leave her job, her mistress, who she got along with very well, and the little children she'd been taking care of. She went to France and got work as an embroiderer. Then it happened again. A man sexually assaulted her, and though she escaped, he learned her secret and threatened to call the police. She had to leave again. In 1882, she left France for New York State, where she went as a woman and found work as a maid for a farm family in upstate New York. After a series of jobs in various places, most of them she was forced to leave after a man sexually assaulted her. This is what happened in the farm in upstate, and it happened a number of times. Jersey City, Milwaukee, Montana. Johanna landed in San Francisco. In San Francisco, she saved up enough money to buy her own little house. She got into the book and newspaper trade. She read a lot in English, perhaps in French, and in German. In the late 19th century, the United States had a robust German language press. She probably also subscribed to stuff by mail from Germany. Germany at the time was having a heyday of what people then called sex reform, which was a small but very loud social movement challenging Imperial Germany's social rules about sex and gender. All of the countries of the world, including the United States, censored print material about sex, and so did Germany. But Germany had a much more relaxed censorship regime than any other country did, and a lot of things slipped through it. Johanna subscribed to some of these publications, and she was extremely interested in the sex reform movement. She thought to herself that it might perhaps have something to do with her own situation. By the 1890s, Germany had the world's first movement for what they called homosexual emancipation and what we might call gay rights. The most prominent leader of that movement was a sexologist called Magnus Hirschfeld. In any other country, Hirschfeld's work and a lot of the agitation coming out of this movement would have been suppressed. But Germany had the world's leading scientific establishment at the time and the best university system, and scientific discussions of sex were permitted. So the movement coded a lot of what it did as scientific inquiry and was able to get around censorship. Despite the German government's relatively progressive stance, those who wanted more sex and gender freedom were nevertheless on the fringe of German society, and the Kaiser's regime could be quite repressive. So they banned the Social Democratic Party for a time and sent police to break up meetings of feminists. As Johanna approached 45, she was living as a woman sometimes, and then also at other times living in another position, passing as a man at work and in public, and only living as a woman within her own house. That caused her stress and distress, but she also had a very understandable fear of again being sexually assaulted and being forced to leave San Francisco, and a fear of blackmail. She also could not have missed the regular reports of arrests in San Francisco's newspapers or failed to hear the stories through her circle of friends. She had quite a few friends in the city's sex industry, stories of trans people who were caught. In 1890, the San Francisco Chronicle covered the trial of Mamie Rubel for breaking the city's 1863 law against quote-unquote cross-dressing. Rubel, who had been dressed in men's clothing, told the court that they were neither male nor female. The judge forced them to undergo a physical exam. A police surgeon declared them female, and they were committed indefinitely to the Stockton Asylum, where years later they died of tuberculosis. More than 40 US cities and more than 20 US states passed these kinds of laws between the 1860s and the early 20th century and kept them into the 1970s. A lot of other states also passed laws against indecency or disguise that were used against quote unquote cross-dressed people. And the US was not unique. In other countries, the situation was much the same. Nor was this like unknown at the time, although it's been forgotten by the majority on the Supreme Court. The legal persecution of trans people under these laws was regularly reported in the newspaper industry. In fact, it was like a favorite of the press in this period. Sensational accounts of quote unquote cross-dressed people who had been quote unquote unmasked, in not only in the United States, but in a lot of other countries. Why Johanna ended up in the historical record at all, however, is not because she was like found out and ended up in one of these sensational reports. It's because one day in her house in San Francisco, she decided to try to do something about her situation. She wrote down and wrote a letter to the most radical feminist group in Germany, Helena Stöcker's Bund für Mutterschutz, and asked them to take up her cause. The feminists she wrote to were extremely radical. They were kind of like 1970s feminists who got sucked back in time to like 19th century Germany, and are like just bewildered by 19th century Germany. But nevertheless, they were baffled by her letter, and instead of replying to her, they sent it on to Magnus Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld did write Johanna back, and they struck up a correspondence. What Johanna wanted, and she expresses this to Hirschfeld, is freedom from police harassment. That was the reform she sought. She ought to be allowed to live as a woman. She was harming no one. Johanna was not the first person to reach out to Hirschfeld. At that time, he was living in Berlin. He had a practice. He was leading this homosexual emancipation organization. And in the years before the First World War, a number of people reached out to him with similar stories. Somebody who eventually reached out to Hirschfeld, although not at first, was a guy named Kurt T. So let me tell you his story. Spring came to Hamburg in 1907 and 1908, and one day in March, Kurt T., who was in his early 20s at the time, went to a barber shop and had his hair cut into a man's cut. He had on men's clothing, and thus he began his life as a man. He did it because he had been continually harassed on the street, not by police, but just by ordinary people. So often children would chase him and taunt him, or adults. When he was dressed as a woman, people on the street thought that he was quote unquote cross-dressed. And this is actually something that you see in a lot of these narratives of trans people in this period, that they are harassed when they're dressed as their birth assigned sex for being cross-dressed, which infuriates them, as you can understand. Strangers often stared at him, and sometimes they confronted him. There were lots of newspaper stories at the time, as I said, about cross-dressed people. There's also this whole genre of literature about cross-dressed spies and burglars, and people who escaped from prison by quote-unquote cross-dressing, or escaped from the military by quote-unquote cross-dressing. So there was a lot of suspicion attached to people who seemed to be quote-unquote cross-dressed. Many people probably thought of like these cases that they read about in the newspaper when they saw Kurt. Um, Kurt came to dread the daily walk to his job in a shop. And then that day in March, in the aftermath of yet another round of taunting by street kids, the answer came to him. He had always felt like a man. From his earliest moments of childhood, he had preferred boys' things. He found it excruciating to put on girls' clothing. It came to him that maybe the kids on the street were right. Maybe he was a man. Why not dress like one? Um, and he found to I think to probably to his delight that it wasn't so complicated to do so. He passed as a man once he had his hair cut and put on man's clothing. He moved to Berlin, um, and when he got to Berlin, he took what seems to have been a somewhat unusual, although not unprecedented step, especially in Germany. He went to the police and asked for a certificate to cross-dress. So you may have heard of these certificates. This is the first one in Germany. Is not the first one in Europe. But I just want to like emphasize that it was not Magnus Hirschfeld's idea. It was this guy's idea. He went on his own without Hirschfeld before he was in touch with him. Uh, how Kurt it occurred to Kurt to go to the police and ask for some kind of a permit. Um, okay, so Napoleon's police around 1800 had created a permit system where people assigned female at birth could apply for permission to wear men's clothing. And this existed throughout the whole century in France. And the French National Archive in Paris still has like I have not seen it, but they still have the file. A lot of the permits, the applications are still there. You can go and read them. People applied for lots of different reasons. It's not a ton of people. I looked at like a 10-year period, and there were like 10 applications in that period. So it's a trickle of applications. People give all kinds of reasons for needing to wear men's clothing, often for health or like professional reasons. But some of the cases are very detailed, and you can see from them that like these are people who, after they got their permit, like lived as men for the rest of their lives and presented as men and were understood by other people to be men. It's not clear that everyone who got a permit did that, but some people seem to have. And I can't say for sure, but I think that Kurt probably had heard of this because there are press reports in Germany about the French permit system that come up in this period when German people are found to be cross-dressed. Sometimes the newspapers will be like, actually the French allow this. They have a permit system. So it also may be, so Kurt transitioned right around the same year that this book came out, this by this guy. So this is Karl M. Baer. He was a Jewish German guy who had an intersex condition. In his 20s, he transitions. He got in touch with Magnus Hirschfeld, and then was encouraged to write. He was a journalist, encouraged to write a memoir. And he wrote a memoir that came out in 1907. So Kurt transitioned in '07 or so, 08. And Baer's memoir was a bestseller in Germany. It was later made into a movie without his permission, that I don't think he likes the movie because it's not very faithful to the book. It's a really interesting text. He was from a Jewish family, and the memoir takes out his Jewishness and presents his family as Christian and French. But it's a very detailed recounting of his childhood and then of his transition in his early 20s. Karl M. Baer was legally entitled, was clearly legally entitled under Prussian law until a penal code reform in 1900. Baer was entitled to change his legal sex designation and his name. And the way that was done at the time was that they would go back to the birth registry in the town and actually cross out the sex designation and write in the other one and write in your name. And his birth registry still exists. You can see it where they've written in his name and his sex designation. If you were a person who had an intersex condition, there was a very long legal tradition in Europe of allowing for legal transition, essentially, although it was framed as a correction of a medical error or error at his birth. that German law, which is or Prussian law, which is an 18th century law, is super interesting, and I need to research it more. But it stipulates that at the age of 18, the person is allowed to self-designate their sex. So until 1900, he had pretty strong legal grounds to transition. After 1900, that law was stricken, and if you're interested, I can talk about why. So it was a little bit more complicated for him. He had to get Magnus Hirschfeld's. He eventually ends up in touch with Hirschfeld, who advocated for him, and Hirschfeld wrote an article about how ridiculous it was that this law had been taken off the books, and what are people supposed to do when they have an intersex condition, and this guy should be allowed to legally transition. And Bear was allowed to do that. But this process of transition for people with intersex conditions ended up being a model for people who were trans who did not have an intersex diagnosis or were not able to get one. And it's a process that is like pretty familiar to people in this period. So the idea of like legal transition is not shocking for lots of reasons. And this I think make just the coincidence of Kurt's decision to transition and this book coming out, I don't know for sure, but I think it's possible that he had read Bear's memoir and then he would have assumed from that that he could legally change his sex and his name. Um, okay, so Kurt T went to the Berlin police. Uh, the Berlin police sent him to Magnus Hirschfeld. So again, like this was not Hirschfeld's idea, but he does get involved. And Hirschfeld decided to help Kurt T. The police at this point had not approved the petition. Hirschfeld said, I'll go with you to the police and we'll talk. Hirschfeld had connections with the Berlin police at this point. And he had lobbied them for a very long time to go easier on gay men, and with a lot of success. He even knew a recently retired police officer who liked to dress as a woman and go for massages. The officer in charge of considering Kurt's petition decided to approve it. He took one look at Kurt. This is from the description of that Hirschfeld wrote, but the officer took one look at Kurt and was convinced that he was a dude. The police officer said, quote, as long as your clothing and your deportment in public does not cause a public disturbance, doesn't cause a crowd to form or anything like that, the police can't do anything to you. So Germany had two laws that were used against trans people, paragraph 183 and paragraph 360, and they both are like public disorder sort of statutes. They don't specifically mention cross-dressing, but that I really don't think we should then be like, there's no law against cross-dressing just because they don't specifically mention cross-dressing because they're consistently used against cross-dressing. If you read the legal literature, like cross-dressing is one of the things they're intended to be used for. But they specifically say public disturbance, right? So there becomes this like injunction to pass for trans people. But Kurt was understood by the cops to be meeting that bar. The police officer said, like, I can see with my own eyes that you're not causing a stir in public when you're wearing men's clothing. You look like just like any other man. And they wrote up a certificate saying that they were granting him permission to wear men's clothing. So this is the first of the German certificates. But again, like there's already 100-year history of this, although only for trans masked people in France. And there may be like other examples in other countries of kind of earlier systems. And legal structures for people with intersex conditions, of course, go back much further as well. So again, like not necessarily the first. Okay. So in Hirschfeld's 1910 book, which is an early description of trans people as distinct from other queer people, he really advocates that like what should be done here is to have a system like the French have. He specifically refers to the French police system. And this is sort of what the Germans eventually ended up with. So this is Gerhard Katter, who was a young guy in the 20s, who initially like goes Hirschfeld after the German Revolution was able to set up a scientific institute called the Institute for Sexual Science, and Gerhard Katter and his mom went together for the first visit with Hirschfeld. I believe when he was like 18, and he ended up getting one of these certificates. And Gerhard Katzler lived into the 80s, so we have like his papers. So this is his actual certificate. 20 years of these certificates. Okay. So So you probably noticed that I haven't talked about the Weimar Republic yet, and I've only talked about the imperial period. What's that about? Weimar, maybe it's not Weimar, it's Imperial Germany that we should be so excited about. No, no, that can't be right. Okay, so let me talk about Weimar. In 1918, Germany lost the First World War and established a democratic government. It was like the second most left of center state in the world at that moment, the first most being the Bolshevik regime. And the Weimar Republic really changed things, although it's not the beginning of this stuff either. It's more of an acceleration, but there are like serious changes in Weimar. So let me tell you the story of one more person to illustrate that. In the 1920s, so after the First World War, a woman named Toni Simon, who had served in the First World War, who had deserted for the German army, good for her, who was prosecuted for desertion. This was a left of center woman. A woman named Toni Simon who survived the First World War, saved up her money, and opened a small cafe in Essen, in the disreputable working class section of the city that was known for kind of communist organizing. She named the cafe Cafe 4711 after a local famous perfume. She really liked perfume. The city fathers of Essen disapproved strongly of Toni and her sort. They would not give her a permit to serve alcohol or to have dancing at her cafe in the evenings. But Toni was 42 years old. She had survived a lot of stuff at that point. She had seen the Kaiser fall. She had seen democracy come to Germany. She was a citizen now. She was not going to let other people dictate how she lived her life. She served beer at her cafe and she had dancing, but she did it carefully. She poured beer in teacups, and if a cop walked in, you had to just down the beer. When it got late at night and there was no sign of the police walking the beat on the streets outside the cafe's door, Toni would put a record on the phonograph or switch on the radio. People pushed back the chairs and tables and danced. Women danced with men, men danced with men, women danced with women, however they liked. Cafe 4711 drew a certain kind of customer, people who wanted to socialize as their actual sex or to flirt and dance with somebody of the same sex. They sipped the beer out of teacups. They read the latest copies of the homosexual magazines that came in the mail from Berlin. The 1918 revolution greatly relaxed the Kaiser's already relaxed censorship regime, and there were a flood of magazines that came out. The first one was Freundschaft, or Friendship for Men. In 1924, a magazine called Girlfriend came out for women. Toni especially looked forward to Girlfriends because in the back section, there was like a 2-page, I mean, it looks actually like its own periodical. I think I probably have but I don't, sorry. It's comes out as the back section of Girlfriends was a magazine called World of Transvestites. Toni's Cafe, which maybe is one of the first trans magazines in the world. Although the whole point of my talk is no, it can't possibly be the first, so we're gonna find another one. But an early for this period. Toni's Cafe soon got a bad reputation with some people, as you can see, those who were against that sort of thing. And in the 1920s, especially outside of Berlin, a lot of Germans were against that sort of thing. So the local newspaper blasted Toni's Cafe, claims that the goings on there were immoral and scandalous, so scandalous they could not be written about in the newspaper because that would injure the sense of shame of our readers. Cafe 4711, the newspaper said, where the waitress is a man, quote unquote. Toni had indeed, since the revolution, gotten the courage to come to work dressed in women's clothing. She favored modern, understated dresses, silk stockings, and when she was out on the town, she liked to wear hats. More and more, she was letting people call her Toni. So the Weimar period carried forward these laws that I mentioned, paragraph 183, the law again, and paragraph 360, both of which were these public indecency kind of laws that were used against quote unquote cross-dressed people. There was also paragraph 175, which prohibited men from having sex with men and was used against trans women. There were also all kinds of quotidian city rules, which are really important in queer history if you think about different works that have focused on them. But liquor licensing regulations, dance permits, which could be withdrawn. There were lots of ways that the city could shut down the cafe, which is what the newspapers wanted. Yet by the 1920s, more than any other country, Germany was allowing queer and trans people to live their lives as they saw fit. No other country on earth would allow these magazines to be published, and there were dozens of them. Uh, a whole new media culture had sprung up in the revolution's wake, that really was like a foundation for a lot of queer and trans organizing. Um, for Tony, the trans press proved to be really crucial. It was by reading World of Transvestites that she and a lot of other transgender people learned that they did have some legal rights under the Weimar Republic. I mean, the police certificates are one thing, but like actually finding out about them is quite another. There are cases like after Kurt got his permit, there are reports of people being arrested for quote unquote cross dressing, like people who clearly don't know that there's this permit system. Um, and indeed, like yeah, okay. So Tony's story, I think, really illustrates the component in this of like publicity and media. Um, so this became clear to Tony after one night, Officer H arrived at Cafe 4711. Officer H of the Essen police, I don't know his real name because the reporters like don't print it, they just call him Officer H, had really like made Tony's Cafe his particular concern. The calls in the newspapers to shut her down seem to have really inspired him. Here's Tony. Inspired by like these calls to shut down Tony's Cafe, Officer H repeatedly cited her for various things. This did not really happen in Berlin in this period. So in Berlin, you see like really open clubs. And so the El Dorado is the most famous, but there are lots of other ones. The El Dorado was really like a trans club. It's known for trans performers. It's sort of in public memory. It's often like a queer club, but it's really like a trans space. There's lots of guidebooks descriptions of the El Dorado you can read about. Also, like here's the press. Lotte Ham, who you see pictured here, who also went by Lothar, was a party organizer and like a club organizer. All of this stuff is going on in Berlin and is like not a problem. A little town or a smaller city like Essen was very different and much more conservative. And Officer H, over the years, had written Tony up for allowing dancing without a permit, for cross-dressing, and for liquor license violations. Sometime in the late summer or fall of 1929, he wrote her up for wearing women's clothing on 3 separate occasions, and she had to go to court. On August 15th, 1929, Tony Simon arrives at the Essen District Court. After a long wait in the courtroom for her case to come up, during which she probably felt nervous, the chairman of the panel of judges rose from the bench and called her name. Tony made her way up to the bench and stood there respectfully, but the judge chairman seemed not to notice her. "Where is the accused?" he said. "Call the accused in." No one moved. Then the judge's eyes fell on Tony, standing at the center of the now dead quiet courtroom. But still, he seemed not to notice her and looked around in confusion. Finally, she said, "I am Simon." Gasps echoed across the room. Tony had come to court dressed as a woman, naturally. She understood from reading World of Transvestites that a person could only be guilty of public disorder, so only culpable under these laws, if the person made a stir on the streets. And Tony never did. She went where she pleased, dressed as a woman. No one ever noticed her. In the courtroom viewing gallery, people craned their necks to see her. The air filled with tittering. Newspaper reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Until finally, the stunned judge chairman found his voice and called for silence. Then he turned to Tony and said to her, "How can you debase yourself like this, coming to court in this getup?" She responded, "I simply feel much better in women's clothing than in men's." She was getting ready to say more, to explain how she never caused a scene on the street, to tell the judge what the clothing meant to her. She later wrote an essay about this experience. And in the essay, she wrote, This clothing isn't a joke. It's not an affront to the public. It's my private lifeline. My mental life is dependent on the clothing. Like a bloom shrivels without water and then thrives again when it is watered, so it is with my body and women's clothing. But Tony did not get a chance to say that because the judge cut her off. He said that the court would not proceed with the hearing so long as the accused was quote unquote cross-dressed. The judge announced that they would reschedule the hearing, and then he fines Tony an enormous sum of 100 marks for misconduct in the courtroom. And these are the headlines, right? The next day, Tony was faced with this in the press, right? Men and women's clothing in court. The newspapers ran painstakingly detailed accounts of her appearance before the judges, down to the scent of her perfume, which was lavender, apparently. They called her grotesque and a quick change artist and a natural masquerade. They said her feet were large and her voice mannish. They wrote the Cafe 4711 was a den of iniquities too scandalous to detail. One of the papers ran a horrible cartoon of Tony, which I'm not going to reproduce, alongside a rude poem about Tony. So they really like pulled out all the stops. But Tony was not somebody who was going to back down easily. What she did was to write to the magazine. She wrote to World of Transvestites for help. She wrote an essay explaining what had happened and calling on the other readers of the magazine, people she had never met but who she thought of her as her sisters. She calls them her Mitschwestern, like my like co-sisters. First, she explained that the Essen reporters were complete asses. They had gotten her outfit wrong and her shoe size. Her dress had been salmon colored, not yellow. She was a size 39. But more importantly, what should she do now? She could be thrown in jail, right? I cannot pay for a lawyer, she wrote, so I'm asking advice from my fellow sisters. Should I appear as a woman at my next court appointment? The women in Berlin had this magazine had given her the courage to go to court in the first place, dressed as her actual self. We have to band together, she thought, and she hoped that the other people who read the magazine felt the same. Tony's faith in her fellow sisters was not misplaced. The magazine ran a reply, a letter from another reader, Liana Franke of Bavaria. Liana was also a transgender woman, and she wrote a very supportive letter. She said, I'm a fan of yours, Tony, and I want you to know that there is a legal remedy. A person such as yourself can apply for special permission from the police to wear women's clothing in public. The judge in Essen is behaving like an idiot, she wrote. She wrote to Tony, the fact that you are a lady on the street and nobody remarks on that is proof that you are indeed a lady. And it is the case that Tony had come to court and left court and returned home without disturbing anyone on the street. Liana says in her letter that she's going to mail the judge a copy of Magnus Hirschfeld's book, that should help him get a clue. But in the meantime, Tony needed to apply for the certificate. So what makes the Weimar Republic special, I contend, is not just, of course, the existence of trans people or really the existence of these certificates, right? Or for that matter, trans medicine, which I'm not really going to talk about, but I can talk about if you want in the Q&A. What's different here is that the Republic is not on purpose, but nevertheless including trans people in a vision of democratic citizenship, and that's what distinguishes the Weimar years. In this democratic society with a free press and open public procedures and legal rights for citizens, you see trans people such as Tony arguing in public that they too have rights as citizens in a democracy. And kind of incredibly, people like the judge in Essen eventually listened, because even if they didn't like trans people, and some of them clearly don't, they nevertheless are forced to acknowledge that this is the way the system works, that in a democratic system, the letter of the law is the law, and one has personal freedoms to determine one's life. So the judge in Tony's case clearly did not approve of her, but he did end up dismissing the charges against her. Tony went back to court, on the 7th of November 1929, and she did in the short time that she had, she did as much as she could to follow Liana from Bavaria's advice. Toni was prepared at her second court appearance with a doctor's certificate attesting that she was a quote-unquote transvestite by the terminology used at the time, and for that reason, the doctor strongly advised her to wear women's clothing in the interest of her mental health. She had not yet managed to get a police certificate, and the Essen police really did not like Toni, so it was going to be hard, but she did eventually get one. But she hadn't got one at this point. But the doctor's certificate was a really key step towards getting a police certificate. At her second court appearance, she was allowed to speak, and she gave a very eloquent description of why she was wearing women's clothing, which the court listened to. The doctor's certificate convinced the judge. In a complete reversal, the prosecutor spoke in favor of acquittal. And the judge agreed. And the judge, this is from Toni's, she wrote a second essay in World of Transvestites, so this is her report of what the judge said. She said, the judge said, one has to understand that there are people, there are human beings who are different than other people. Since the police think so generously today about these people and even issue certificates to them, these transvestite certificates, we have to acquit this person, is what the judge said. It was a sensation in Essen, according to Toni. It was a great victory for transvestites. She wrote, now even people in Essen and neighboring cities know that there are transvestites. She was proud and relieved, and she was especially grateful to Liana Franca, the woman who had written to her. Indeed, by the final years of the Weimar Republic, a lot of people knew about transgender people. If you look at city guides to Berlin in the period, there are like reports of trans nightlife and descriptions of what is a transvestite. It's certainly not the case that trans issues were in the national press regularly in Germany in the final years of the Republic, or that they drove people to the polls to vote one way or another. Neither were gay issues. Like LGBTQ politics were just not wedge issues in Germany, or really anywhere in this period the way that they are today. But there is widespread awareness of like queer and trans culture. Okay. Okay, so just as the Nazi regime in 1933, after Hitler became chancellor, swiftly dismantled what was left of the democratic system, it also gutted the worlds the transgender people had built. After Hitler took power, the Essen police, shortly after, went to Toni Simon and took away her permit to cross-dress. They shut down her cafe. This was forcing Toni to detransition. She was forced to wear men's clothing in public, and she could not tolerate it, so she left Essen. Toni has a rather like unusually detailed trace in the archive, even through the Nazi period. She was convicted of breaking the law against malicious gossip, which was a law against criticizing the regime, and served a year in prison. After she was released, which I should say, the law against malicious gossip, like not a lot of people were convicted under that law. And you had to be pretty egregious to get convicted. There are a lot of like warnings. So the fact that she was convicted and served time for that, I think we can, that file is missing, her conviction under that law, but like I think it's pretty safe to assume that she was like a very staunch critic of the regime, which is something that most quote unquote Aryan Germans were not. After she was released, the Gestapo decided that they were going to send her to a concentration camp because she was a transvestite, and she has a Gestapo file where the Gestapo write about like how she is a transvestite. She's been a transvestite for a long time, and how horrible she is, and that they've got to find her. Happily, they were not able to find her. She survived the Nazi regime, and she actually went on to like have a activist career after the war in Germany as well. Other transgender women were not as fortunate. So Lydie Backhoff of Hamburg, and a number of other women were arrested, sent to the camps, and murdered. And according to my own unpublished research, trans women were far more likely to be sent to camps and murdered than were gay men on average. That the number of people murdered by the regime under paragraph 175, which is the law against male-male sex, is disproportionately trans women and cis men who sold sex. So I wrote an essay about all this recently, and I called the Weimar Republic the first transgender republic. And maybe that was like whack of me. Maybe I'm overstating things there. And I mean, Xavier Nunn, right, our friends has written about this. Certainly, the liberation that Weimar offered was very fell far short of the robust like legal protections and social acceptance that transgender liberation demands. And Weimar was certainly nothing like Germany would eventually become in terms of legal protections. The certificates are not legal transition. It was tough to get a certificate. It didn't solve all of one's problems with identity documents. Yet in Weimar, the just and decent treatment of trans people by state and society was tied to democracy. And when one fell, so did the other. Trans rights are thus a sort of canary in the coal mine of democracy. The canary's distress and alarm about a rising tide of authoritarianism, which will ultimately threaten not just the canary itself, but everyone else. Just as in the Nazi period, unchecked police power suppressed all sorts of expression and visited violence on many people, reaching far beyond trans communities. Thank you.